car in this video, I wanted to keep the markings on the side intact to start. However, the underside of these old Roundhouse cars are bare metal, so after removing the trucks, I applied masking tape to the sides and then took it out to the garage to prime it black. In this case, I used Games Workshop Citadel brand Chaos Black. After the primer had dried, I removed the tape and set up for the next step. The next step is to add a lighter color to the interior of the gondola. After masking off the top of the car, I sprayed the tub with a 1:2 mix of Tamiya X55 Deck Tan and XF80 Royal Light Grey. This really is representative of the gondola in its newest, fresh out of the factory state. It also provides some direct contrast to the black of the outside of the car, at least initially, even if it does get covered over in later steps. The next part of the story is simply what happens to railcars when in their natural environment. The sun and the elements do their work, and the original paint begins to fade. Fading using an airbrush is a quick and easy step that starts to age the gondola. In this case, I created a translucent mix starting with roughly 10 parts Pledge Future Floor Polish to 1 part Tamiya XF2 Flat White and 1 part XF21 Flat Base. Future, while a household product, is actually clear acrylic and has a great many uses in modeling. Some of you may be familiar with it, but I do make good use of it as a clear coat or creating translucent coats like this one. I sprayed the upper parts of the gondola with this mixture, adding light coats to simply lighten the paint. My mix here was a bit glossier than I liked, but it still worked. Graffiti is a reality of modern railcars, although truth be told, even in the days before the invention of spray paint in 1949, railcars bore an early form of graffiti from rail riding hobos in the 1920s. It is rare to see an entire train go by without at least some graffiti on at least one of the cars. In telling the story of this gondola, I wanted to have the faded remnants of old graffiti that would have seen the ravages of time. The basic techniques are the same as hand painting fresh graffiti, just the colors are muted. I started with sketching out some of the designs on a scrap piece of paper for a bit of practice. I then used a pencil to put the design outlines onto the gondola. These outlines do not have to be fancy, but enough to get the overall shape. Often it's a good idea to look at prototype examples, but if your search foo is strong, you can find websites dedicated to the art of real railroad graffiti and how to do it. Yes, these websites do state explicitly that applying graffiti to a railcar is both illegal and dangerous, but gives tips anyway. Once the pencil outlines were done, I then used Citadel layer paints Screaming Skull and White Scar with a fine brush to either trace the outline of the graffiti or to fill it in. Citadel layer paints don't cover as well as their base paints, but that is intentional for the blending methods that they have developed for their paint line. It works perfectly for graffiti. I then used Abaddon Black to lighten up the lines by painting along the edges of the lighter brushstrokes. Sticking to black, white, and an off-white color shows how rattle can spray paint that graffiti writers use will fade over time. Lighter colors tend to go white or off-white, while darker colors go black. The next part of this gondola's story shows the wear and tear from years and years of service. Starting with a mix of Citadel's base paints, Abaddon Black and Dryad Bark, I used a small torn sponge to apply the paint in such a way that the paint on both the exterior and interior of the gondola would be chipping away. This is also applied over the graffiti from the previous step to help it age further. The key to sponge painting is to mix a bit on your palette, dip the sponge into the mix, and then dab most of it off before lightly applying it to the model. As part of the process, I also masked off the bottom part of the gondola's sides, as many of the prototype pictures showed less rust and wear in this area. The steel on the sides would be rusting from the inside as well, but the parts that are attached to the floor would not. After the mask was applied, I went back with more of the same color. Once this was done, I then used the same technique with a lighter color, Mournfang Brown. First adding a bit of the previous mix and sponging it on, and then finally using it by itself. This begins to show some older rust colors. Citadel colors should never be used straight from the bottle, but rather mixed on a palette with a bit of water to get the right consistency. The last part of this step was to remove the masking tape and to apply a bit more of the lighter rust color in the very light touches with the sponge. At this point, I decided to add an acrylic wash using Citadel's Agrax Earthshade. I needed to get some grunge into the corners of the gondola's tub, and this was a way to do it quickly. Unlike the paints, this is a pre-mixed wash that can be applied straight out of the bottle. It normally dries to a nice matte finish. I applied this with a larger brush with even strokes and let it dry. Following this, I wanted to add some detail rust spots. I used the Citadel Layer Paints Scrag Brown and Squig Orange with the finest detail brush I have in my arsenal. Starting with the Scrag Brown, I applied the fine dots of this paint into the interior parts of some of the larger rust spots that were previously applied with the sponge. I then went back and did the same thing, doing even a step lighter with the Squig Orange. These spots will provide a guidepost for when I do some rust streaking with oil paints later on. Once this was done, it was on to the next step. Before moving on to the next steps that involve oil-based paints, I wanted to protect the work that I've already done. Using a mix of Future Floor Polish and a bit of Tamiya X28 thinner, I used the airbrush to quickly spray down the car on all sides. This creates a nice glossy finish that will accept oil-based applications. After I let it dry, it is time for a pinwash using oil paints. A pinwash is applying a wash to a specific area of a model rather than a general application as was seen in the previous step. There are many ways that this can be achieved, either through pre-made products or by thinning down an oil paint to wash consistency. In this case, I used Abteilung's 502's Starship Filth from their Fantasy line. This color works great as it appears a dark gray, but when spread out onto a model, there is some brown pigment as well. Perfect for this kind of work. Using odorless mineral spirits as a thinner, I mixed the paint to create a wash, then took some clear thinner, lightly brushing it over the car to help the wash flow where it needed to. I then used a small brush, applying the wash only to the nooks and crevices of the model, mainly along the edges of the ribs on the outside. Don't worry if it pools oddly, because then we can move to the next step. Once this is done, let the model dry for at least 20 minutes. Once the wash had a chance to dry a little bit, I took a small, flat brush that was still dry and smoothed and blended the edges where the wash had pooled. This nicely blends the wash into the rest of the paint. Once this is done, I let this dry for about 24 hours before moving on to the next step. Repeating the clear gloss coat using Future Floor Polish from before, I quickly sprayed another clear coat onto the model and let it dry. Rust streaks are nicely and easily done using oil paints, and in this case I have a couple of pre-mixed colors. Abteilung 502's Dark Rust is perfect for this next step. Simply take a really small brush and apply tiny dots of the dark rust paints to areas where the sponge chipping and rust from earlier in the weathering process. It's also helpful to apply a bit of paint to the underside of the lip of the car, and I also applied a few dots to the interior of the car as well. Once the dots were applied, I used a small flat brush to draw the paint downward. It works best with the brush being almost dry. If needed, I would wet it with a bit of white spirit thinner and then wipe most of it out on a paper towel. Too much thinner and the streaks or dots will disappear altogether. I'd suggest starting with a dry brush and then apply thinner if necessary. I then let the model dry before applying a matte coat. My preferred method these days for a matte coat is to airbrush a mix of 3 parts Future floor polish to 1 part Tamiya X21 flat base. Future by itself is very glossy, but the flat base is an additive that creates an impressively dead flat finish in this ratio. Since the steps after this required more work with acrylic paints, the flat finish was necessary to give some tooth to the surface for the paint to stick to. Similar to step 4, the graffiti is applied in the same way. I used a pencil to sketch out a few larger pieces. The main difference here is that this time I would be adding color. In this way, the Citadel paints are excellent for this kind of work, as the paints are arranged in color families that can take the guesswork out of what it takes to make a good blend. One of the markings I wanted to have look like a graffiti artist was just starting out on a major piece or a wild style before they were either caught or had to flee for fear of being caught. This one I traced out as a partial outline in purple. The second piece I started with a color called Bois Flesh, a green color, to build up the next part, blending it up with the lighter colors in the same line. I traced the outline using a very fine brush using black and then a bit of white to make the details pop. While I had white available, I used them to create tags or small signatures of graffiti, which is the quickest and most basic form. Moving to the other side, I did another wild style form, although knowing full well that I would be covering at least part of this one up with when I eventually do the patch for the road numbers. As you can see, the application of the graffiti is perhaps the longest single step in this process. It really is optional and not to everyone's taste, but I wanted to include it as part of the story of this car. Old graffiti and new graffiti contrasted together. Once the graffiti had been applied, I then did another clear gloss coat and set up to apply both a dark wash using MIG Productions pre-mixed dark wash and Abteilung 502's light rust oil paint. The difference here is that I did not pre-wet the surface of the model with white spirit thinner, rather applying the dark wash directly to the edges of the ribs around where the graffiti was applied. This helps to blend the graffiti into the surface of the model and simulates a bit of dirt and grime that would quickly accumulate or show through the work. Similarly, I applied the light rust to previous chips of a similar color. I also applied it inside of several of the already existing streaks of dark rust. Since light rust tends to be newest and should be applied on top of the darker rust colors, I let both the wash and the light rust spots dry for about 20 minutes before coming back with a largely dry, small, flat brush, using downward strokes to soften the edges of the wash and to streak the light rust downward. If needed, I would dampen the brush with a bit of white spirit, dry it out mostly on a paper towel, and use the edges of the brush to shape the rust streaks in the way that I needed to. Once this was completed and dried, I applied another matte coat using the previous technique, but this time I applied the same mix to the trucks as well. Now that all of this is done, I can now add some small patches of black paint onto which the repaired road numbers will be applied. Using the 3mm masking tape, I placed it around the existing Burlington Northern road number. Using Tamiya XF1 flat black, I then carefully sprayed the area and let it dry. To make it ready to accept decals, I needed the surface to be a bit glossy, so simply a Future floor polish and a brush, I quickly brushed over the area and let it dry. I decided to create a new reporting mark for both of the cars, settling on the letters PJX. For this car, I decided to keep the original road number. Using a surplus sheet of microscale TTX flat car and boxcar decals, I was able to piece together the reporting mark and the road number, applying the decals individually, although I tried to find groups of the letters to make this process easier. I used microset prior to the application. and after it had dried a bit, gently brushed microsole over the decals. Once this had dried, I then did a second brush application of Future and let it dry. The last step was another matte coat, and it was time to do the trucks and then the final weathering step. Time to do the trucks and wheel sets. Starting with a clear matte coat using my previous method, I then hand-painted the springs with Moranfang Brown, lightened with a bit of Scrag Brown, both Citadel paints. These give a nice rust color. I also painted the metal wheel sets using the same color, but adding in a bit of Forge World's brand of light rust weathering pigment to give it some texture. Once the paint had dried, I then airbrushed a 1:3 mix of Tamiya XF57 Buff and XF68 NATO Brown. This is mostly for an aging rust-type color on the trucks, but also could simulate the reddish dust common to the Canadian Maritimes. After this step, I would add some black to the trip pins, and then an acrylic wash of Agrax Earthshade to bring up the details. To handle the dust and dirt on the model, I finally went to weathering pigments. I mixed MIG Productions Brick Dust along with Forge World's Light Rust weathering pigments on a palette. I then mixed it with a bit of White Spirit odorless thinner and carefully brushed it onto the lower part of the model. While working with the pigments and thinners, the pigments virtually disappear when mixed, but once dry they re-emerge. This worked the way that I wanted to, but after the thinner had dried, the effect can be strong. I started by using a dry brush to soften the edges where the pigment pooled, and even used my finger to brush away the excess pigment. I decided this was probably a bit too strong even after softening, so then I used my matte coat mixture to tone it down further. Off camera, I decided to come back with a very light direct application of brick dust pigment straight out of the container, applying it with a small flat brush. The final step would be to secure the pigments to the model using MIG Productions Pigment Fixer. This stuff is what you need to make sure your pigments stay on the model the way that you have placed them, and without dust getting all over your layout. The pigments disappear when the fixer is applied, but unlike other clear coat methods, the pigments re-emerge after it dries. It can be applied with a brush or an airbrush. In this case, I used an airbrush, which also helps with a matte finish. I would then reassemble the wheel sets, reattach the trucks, and this heavily weathered gondola was all set for scrap service.